my pleasure to welcome all of you to Bilkent University. I'm Michelle Adams. I'm a professor in the psychology department and director of the interdisciplinary graduate program in neuroscience. And firstly, I'd like to thank all the participants and the discussants and the presenters and all the organizers and for their help in getting this conference going. I'd like to specifically thank the university administration for their support for this conference. And I'd like to note that this type of interdisciplinary ventures are very supported by the Bilkent University, especially the rector Abdullah Atlar and provost Adnan Akay. And this social cognition conference is actually a capstone event for a newly established mind, brain, and behavior research group who also help support the organization of this conference. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge Ali Doramaja, the son of our founder, Ihsan Doramaja, who is extremely supportive of these types of events, and also was a former provost and now the head of the board of trustees. He sends his regrets that he couldn't make it to the conference, but knows that we're going to have a very productive and interesting discussion and wishes us all well. So with that, I'd like to actually begin the first session.
Explain the rules of the game is that Marco, well, I should introduce Marco Fenici if you don't know him. He's from Developmental Philosophy in Bilkent. He joined us from the University of Florence recently. Each speaker will have, during the day, we'll have...
Good evening. We'll have 50 minutes each, and then there'll be 10 minutes comments, in this case by Bill Wrench from the Department of Philosophy, and then there'll be 30 minutes for questions.
Does it work? Yes. Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. I am very happy to be here. Very glad to. Actually, it's a honor for me to start this conference. So I was talking about my training today, and since this is really the first talk, I thought that I might just give a short introduction about the concept of social cognition that we are going to discuss today, not just in the talk, but in the whole conference in this weekend. Mind reading. What is mind reading? It is the capacity to report our propositional attitudes. It is a traditional definition. When we are talking about propositional attitudes, we are talking about the reports of mental states such as beliefs, desires, and intentions. So mind reading is the capacity to report propositional attitudes, to attribute mental states to others, and to use such postulated or observed attributions in the prediction and in the explanation of behavior. So this is kind of standard definition. How does it work? This is just an example of a mother trying to process the road. So there is, with a child, it is supposed, according to many psychologists, in many cases of everyday life, in this kind of social situations, what's going on is some sort of this reasoning. So the mother is thinking, well, the driver saw us, therefore the driver knows that we are here. Since he knows that we are here and he doesn't want to run over us, the driver doesn't have the intention to run over us, therefore he must stop the car. Okay? So that's the conclusion of a practical argument, practical syllogism, that allows the mother to cross the road because the road is safe. She knows that it's safe because she reasoned about the mental states of the driver. So that's the kind of a kind of social situation in which psychologists they assume that we are almost attributing mental states to each other. This has been investigated since almost 40 years by now in a procedure that is called the false belief task. And here I'm using the pictures from a study by 1985, a very influential study by Simon Baron-Cohen, but I want to stress that the first study published on this was really by Joseph Werner and Heinz Wimmer, and this from 1983. So it's a big honor for me to present this in front of Joseph Werner. So how does this procedure work? Sorry?
Don't get it wrong.
Okay. Yeah, it's a big honor and a big burden. So the test works, and it's just in their studies they put a picture, so this is what I am using. 1985. So the test goes this way. There are two characters, Sally and Anne. And the children are shown the following story. They are told, well, there are two containers, a basket and a box. So children are told that Sally is playing with a ball, and then she puts the ball in the basket. But then she decides to play in the garden, so she leaves the scene. In her absence, Anne is just taking the ball out of the basket and puts it in the box. So children are then asked, well, look, Sally is coming back, where we should look for the ball. So where is she looking for the ball, according to you? Mr. Feder? Okay, so Professor Feder just passed the false belief. Okay, but the striking result is that children, they don't get it right until age 4. And this has been replicated thousands of times by now. So it's a very robust result, which brought to the question, why are they failing the task before? So why cannot they make the right prediction, which depends on the understanding that Sally, she doesn't know that the ball has been moved to the other places, so she should still go for the place where she thinks that the ball is, okay? So the initial answer for this came from very different accounts, kind of late competence accounts, which are labeled with the general label of constructivist account. So those accounts, they argue that the problem that children have is that they lack, for some different reasons, the concept of belief until age 4. Therefore, in order to pass the task, you first have to construct your concept of belief. Once you construct that concept, then you can pass the task. But this interpretation has been challenged in the last 10 years by more recent results, starting from a seminal paper by Fenici and in 2005, which found they replicated the false belief procedure with infants of 15 months. So just to give you an example, here you have, for example, you have a toy and two containers, two different boxes of different colors, and children are just, well, infants, 15-month-olds are just following this scene, and so there is an experimenter who's first placing the object the toy always in the same location, and then search for it there, and then there is a false belief trial, where, for example, in the false belief yellow condition, the object, first the experimenter sees that the object moves from one box to the other. Then a spring is raised so that the experimenter disappears from the scene, and in her absence, the object goes back to the initial location. And what it was found is that the infants, so then in the test trial, infants have shown either the experimenter looking for the object according to the place where she knows that the object is, or whether to the real location of the object. And the results have been showing that across different trials, children have shown longer looking times in the situation in which the experimenter is looking for the object according to the real position of the object, suggesting that infants are surprised in this case because the experimenter is doing something that is against their expectations. So this result has been tested in 15-month-olds and suggests that by 15 months, infants already have some capacity to have a prediction that agents will look for the object according to the place where they last saw the object. So following this data and other studies that I'm not summarizing here, it has been suggested that infants, they already have a capacity to attribute mental states much earlier than the time they pass the explicit response false belief task. And so those are different accounts. They claim more or less is that this is an innate capacity that has been selected through the history of our species. And so that the problem with the false belief task at age 4 is just that infants cannot deploy this capacity because of performance constraints, but they already have the capacity to attribute mental states. So here you have different proposals. Now, I must say that this is kind of received view now. So nativism is, because more results have been coming from these spontaneous response false belief tasks, nativism is now taken as kind of standard view in developmental psychology. And And it's becoming also a kind of aggressive view. So, for example, here I have a quote by a champion of nativism, Peter Carruthers, and here he writes about kind of, he's talking about constructivist approaches. He says, well, these approaches have not proven empirically fruitful, no new discoveries have resulted, and in every case where the determinate proposal of this sort has been tested and controlled for, it has been refuted. In any case, I will not discuss such accounts here, okay? This is in the introduction of the paper. So just to say, yeah, in the past people believed something, but this is just wrong, so let's keep on doing something new. So I want to say nativist accounts are kind of aggressive today, and they are dominating the scene, but I still think that there are reasons for why we should at least be concerned with nativist accounts, so that we should even consider the possibility for constructivism. So this is the story according to the received view. First, you have 15-month-olds, they pass spontaneous response fulfilling tasks, and there is kind of developmental continuity, which brings children in age 4 to pass at least the response fulfilling tasks. And what is here is just that there is maturation of different performance capacities, inhibitory capacities, executive functions that allow infants to deal with this task that has just some constraints that are higher than the spontaneous response task. So today, instead, I want to challenge this nativist received view, and I want to do this by discussing two important questions. So the first is really about what does 4-year-old success in the false belief test indicate, and we'll have a suggestion for this based on the relevance of language for children's understanding of the task. But I want to start from a more general question. That is just about what is the nature of mind reading. I think that if we don't reconsider the nature of mind reading, we are not able to address the whole picture in a different way. So, with respect to this second question, the received view has a kind of traditional response. And I want to stress, so this is, I call it the thesis of natural mind reading in a recent paper we published with my co-author, William Groffoli. It has also been called less, like the social cognitive syndrome by Ted Sawicki in a recent book, like it is a kind of obsession in interpreting all the data in the same way. And we are talking about the received view as a mix of different theses that are consistent one with each other and are supporting each other. So I think it's important to identify these different theses, because if you don't challenge them one by one, it's very hard to have to raise general skepticism about the received view. So the received view comes as an interconnection of different proposals. One is about the use of mind reading. So the claim is that social cognition is very important in everyday life. So we are continuously attributing mental states. But of course, we are not doing this consciously. We are doing this just implicitly. But mind reading is really a pervasive capacity in our everyday life. The second assumption is about the cognitive basis of mind reading. So here's the idea that we have a domain-specific capacity to deal with the attribution of mental states to others. The third idea concerns the origin of mind reading. So the idea here is that we have this domain-specific capacity because it has been functional to the development of our species. Therefore, it has been selected through natural evolution. And the fourth idea is that because this capacity has been selected in the course of natural evolution, it is innate. Therefore, it matures in the course of ontogenetic development, like many other abilities, and like kind of there is a kind of maturational model of the development of this capacity. So those ideas are all together. I want to raise some concerns about each of them separately. So let's just move. Okay, and here, for example, we have a quote by René Baillargeon, who is another really champion of the received view. She claims infants' ability to infer and reason about other mental states depends on a content-rich, adaptive neurocomputational system that begins to operate early in life. So here you see how those claims are condensed together in a very short sentence. It's So it's a capacity that is content-rich, that is, it is domain-specific to the attribution of mental states. It is adaptive. It has been selected through natural evolution, natural selection. It depends on a neurocomputational system, so it is a neurocognitive capacity. And it begins to operate daily life. It is innate. Okay. So you really see that those are claims that are all compact. Usually they're not much discussed. They just come to present or to introduce the received view in a general way. Now, I have many theoretical concerns about this, so I will just focus on some of the concerns that I think are more important. The first of them is related to a risk of kind of explanatory circularities. This is said very shortly, very well by Gabriella Rienti in this paper. She says, well, how to avoid the risk of begging the question, which is theory of mind reading, is what is measured by false belief tasks. So just to give a clarification of this answer, when psychologists they are designing false belief tasks, they assume that if a child has mind reading abilities, then the child should be able to pass the false belief task. Then later in the study, they design the study, we have the results, and the assumption is that, well, since the child passed the false belief task, then the child must possess theory of mind ability or mind reading abilities. But of course, we cannot take the two things at the same time. Otherwise, the risk is of going in explanatory circularity. So there is, of course, it's just an naive view of what psychologists are doing. So it might be challenged very easily. But we should be aware that when we are defining false belief tasks, we are defining an operational capacity. So we are not measuring something that is already given by nature, and we are just trying to measure cognitive abilities, but we are creating an operational construct. If we are not aware of this, we can run into the risk of taking a circular explanation of what mind reading is. So, a second theoretical concern I have about mind reading is about the evidence that we have for it. So this comes from long philosophical discussion in the 60s and 70s, where philosophers were discussing about the semantics of mental state attributions. So what is the meaning of proposition attitudes, of expressions that are reporting mental states? And at the end of this discussion, there were very different proposals. And one particular proposal was about the idea that mental state terms, they are theoretical objects that allow us to make predictions. So I want to stress that this is not an intuition, a simple idea. It's a very sophisticated philosophical proposal in the field that has been advanced by many, and then it is one of the most important philosophers that advanced it. To defend his claim, he was making claims like this, that we use mind reading all the time to make predictions about others' behavior. But again, this is a philosophically informed proposal. It's not an intuitive idea. And he claims, well, look, there are large areas in every life in which mind reading is extraordinarily reliable in its predictive power. For example, every time we venture on a highway, we stake our lives on the reliability of our general expectation about the perceptual beliefs, the normal desires and decision proclivities, and of other motorists. So here he's claiming, look, we are mind reading all the time, we're just doing this unconsciously, but it is a very pervasive capacity. But I wonder why this must be the case. So I remember the instruction I was given when as a child, I attempted to cross the road. Or I was learning to cross the road in a street. And well, I realized that I'm an Italian child, so these instructions are related to Italy. Maybe in Germany you have different instructions. It's just you go on the zebra crossing and you cross the street. Because, or in the US even more, because the cars are stopping way before they see you on the zebra crossing. But in Italy, the instructions are the following. Okay, so you have to look left, look right. If there are no cars arriving, then you can just cross the street. If there are cars arriving, then wait the car to pass and then start again. So you look left and you look right. There is no really mentioning of the desires, the beliefs, the perception of the driver. It's just a very basic script where you have to be sure there are no cars that you don't see cars that are arriving. So why should we suppose that cases like this are filtered by our capacity to attribute mental states to others? Couldn't we just rely on more basic scripts of social interaction? So, and I think that this is a general problem with confabulation, okay? We have many intuitive ideas about how we are working, okay? And psychologists have been doing research in this time, in the last 30 years, for about many different fields, about intuitive mathematics, intuitive physics, and the general discovery that has been found generally is that we have theories about how we are functioning, and then the psychological mechanisms that are supporting those theories are really very different. So folk mathematics is very different from cognitive mathematics, how our brain does mathematics. Folk physics is very different from how our brain really processes physics. So why it must be the case that in case of folk psychology, our folk psychological theories are really the same? It will be very opposed to the trend that we have been testing by studying cognitive psychology in the last 60 years. Okay? And I think that the situation is even worse, because here we are not discussing about adult folk psychology, but we are discussing about children's folk psychology, which seems that you could have also an adult-centric bias, so that we would be attributing to the child a naive and wrong theory about how we suppose that adult people are thinking when they are reasoning about others. If you put together those two biases, you get what I call the adult population bias. Okay? So using a wrong theory to read the child's mind. So this is a kind of second concern that I have about the received view about mind reading. The third concern, and then I will stop with theory, I will go more in detail in critical studies, although I'm still a philosopher, so I like to stay in the theoretical side. It is, for example, here is Carruthers, he is describing the functioning of the theory of mind module, of the mind reading module, and he writes, well, for example, if an infant sees a toy placed into a box in the presence of another agent, the infant encodes something like the agent is aware of the toy going into the box, and the infant computes and therefore after remembers the representation is the agent thinks the toy is in the box. You see that this is in capital letters because in philosophy it is a tradition that where you are quoting something that is, you are representing the concept of the agent, you're using capital letters for that. But the problem is, how are we supposed to intend such talk about mental representations? Do we have capital letters in our head? Of course not. So we want to know, is this just a metaphorical way of talking about the functioning of the mind reading module? How can we get out of this metaphor into something that is more coherent with what we know about cognition? And for that I have, so in trying to investigate, in trying to address this kind of question, I have a question for the audience about this face. So, who is represented in this picture? This is a question for the audience. And Medici or God? Okay, well, Medici or Sylvester Stallone, it's very different. To me, this really looks like Sylvester Stallone, okay? But actually, it's a cardinal in the Vatican's room that were pictured by Raffaello around the mid of the 16th century, okay? So, of course, Raffaello couldn't be depicting Sylvester Stallone in this picture, right? But the problem is, why are we claiming, or can we be led to think that this is Sylvester Stallone? Well, because he looks like Sylvester Stallone. Do we have a good account of what is to look like something else? I think we can spell it out in terms of structural similarity. So here you have a face on your left, you have on the right, it's a picture by a drawing in the Renaissance who liked to do to representing faces with all kinds of fruits or other objects. And why, when we are looking at this pattern here, do we think that it looks like a face? I mean, this is not a face. There is a pear here, there are apples around, everything is just made of fruit. But we still think that this is a face. Well, so the proposal is that we think it's a face because there is a structural similarity between these two configurations. So what you have here on the left is something that has a structure, a special configuration that is replied here on the right. And because there is this relation of elements one-to-one, we can see that this that is here looks like the thing here on the left. So to get to the real problem here, it is, well, we have infants that they are showed some data in implicit false belief tasks, for example, and they display some manifest behavior. But why should we say that the cognitive processes, the black box that allow them to do this kind of reasoning, is a mind-reading process, is a process of attributing mental states to others? Well, if we keep this idea of structural similarity, it must be because there must be some significant relation between what's going on in the child's mind and the full psychology. It is the set of general rules that relates the meaning of different mental state terms. If there is not such a kind of relation, then why should we say that these processes are just mind-reading processes? Couldn't we use some different descriptions to make sense of these processes? So I think that people in the supporters of the received view, they must be committed to the claim that there must be such significant structural similarity between full psychology, the processes that are going on in the infant's mind, and the rules of full psychology. Otherwise, the claim is just empty. Here, I don't want to get too much into details of this, but I want to make the point that there is a general problem, that the mind is something that is never observed, it's something that is supposed to be behind our capacity to act. So you always have a kind of logical problem here. You are seeing somebody acting in front of you, you are predicting the behavior. Of course, the behavior might depend on the mental process of the agent, but maybe you might just read the surface of the behavior, rather going behind that and predict the behavior as well. So there is a threat to a challenge to nativism theories, that is, you might pass those tasks not by really attributing mental states, but just by reading the action that is displayed in front of you. And there have been several accounts of this, so I proposed one in my article on phenomenology and the cognitive sciences, but of course there have been other proposals. I just used the general label of action reading accounts for those. I don't want to get into the details now, because I just want to keep this presentation more general, so I will just keep about my proposal about how to interpret the data in the implicit false belief task. So, just to have a summary of this first part, I have been discussing different challenges that we can, that provide a reason for being concerned about the received view of mind reading. So in particular, a challenge of explanatory circularity, a challenge of adult population, and a challenge about how to determine the representation content of these processes. And this is a general challenge to the idea that we use full psychology in everyday figuring others' behavior. Might be different, but maybe it's promising to look for other solutions. And the proposal that I want to sketch today, and I have been defending in my last research, it is concerned with an important distinction about social cognitive capacities and about the situation in which they are adopted. So in everyday life, we have a lot of social interaction that is kind of context dependent. We are just reacting towards people that are in front of us. And the important thing that characterizes this kind of social interaction, it is that the information that is used is just available in the environment. So whenever there is a bag on the chair, do I have to remember that? Well, I can just look. So in many cases, it's easier for me to react with the environment than really to appeal to my capacities in order to have some kind of proper interaction with the environment. And this is very different from a second different kind of social interaction that you have nowadays, which is social interaction that is independent from the context. So for example, where you are on the phone. where you are talking with the phone with somebody, and of course the reference, the physical framework in which you are acting is very different from the physical framework in which the receiver is acting. I want to stress that the context-independent social interaction really depends on the possibility for us to interact with people who are not in our social environment. And my view is that this kind of capacity, despite the fact that it is very pervasive in our everyday life, it's something that wasn't so important at the origins of our species, where for our ancestors it was much easier to interact in the environment rather than to interact in the distance. And what's the big difference here is the role, for me, is the role of language. Once our species started to have a language that could be used to discuss about different situations, and once that the social communities started to be scattered in the environment, so that it was very common to have information that was not shared among the people social interacting with you in a direct context, then it became much more important for our ancestors to track features of the environment that were not present at the time. Before that, this was not much relevant. So the claim is that mind reading is something that depends on, that refers to social situations which were not the most common ones at the origin of the social life of our species. And here, the nativist view is committed to a very naive view, I would say, about the origins of psychological capacity. A view that is committed to the neurodarwinian synthesis about the development of our species, where selection pressures stemming from the environment decides changes in the species. And of course, the individuals, they can learn things in their lives, but those adaptments are lost after the individual's death. So it seems that if you are a reductionist about the evolution of our species, you think that every change needs to be determined by a genetic modification in our DNA, and that natural selection just selects the DNA that best adapts to the environment. But what ethologists and evolutionary scholars in evolutionary theories are telling us today is that this picture of the evolution is just very naive, because evolution is something much more complex. In particular, here for example, you have an example of termites. They are building huge termite nests, and which are, of course, are remaining there. So the termite might die, but the nest stays there and is passed over to the next generations. So we have to have an ecological view about natural selection and species evolution, where the individual, they modify the environment and pass it down to the next generations, so that natural selection operates on the level of the matching between the environment, the organisms that are living there, and the niche constructing activities of the organisms that are building the environment in a way that is carried over to the next generations. In the case of the human species, things are even much more complex than this, because we have neuroplasticity. So our brain is designed so to be very adaptable in the first timing of ontogenetic development. And we are exploiting this hugely. In particular, we have extended practice of pedagogy, of social engineering, where we are training our children to react to the environment in new ways that are not encoded into the genes. And there are many cases of scaffolded learning, so that the child is asked to learn new things from the caregiver. So that in the case of human species, we are talking of the developmental niche, that is beside or an extension of the ecological niche. It is a niche that is made exactly to make the child learn new capacities once she's born. And this gives the cultural niche, that is a niche of cultural capacities that are passed over by a generation to the other, not because they are inscribed in our genes, but because they are just shared in the individuals of our species, and they have been acquired because they were useful in the first place. So I'm suggesting that in the case of our species, there are a lot of cultural abilities, and the evolution of our species is something like the roots of these trees. Of course, the roots of these trees, they are made of biological materials. They are made of wood and water and chemical substances, but their particular shape is not defined by the encoding, the DNA encoding of this tree. The squared shape depends on the pattern, the food pattern which this tree has been growing up. And the mind of the child is something like this tree. It has some biological adaptive capacities, but the way in which it is shaped is strongly defined by the pattern, that is, by the social practices by which we train our children to become human. So this is a kind of perspective that I've been developing with my co-author Guido Garofoli in this paper about the biocultural emergence of mind reading. And here we discuss and we try to parallel the case of mind reading in ontogenetic development with the discussion about the onset of mind reading abilities in our species. So this discussion would challenge the claims about the origin of mind reading in the evolution of our species. How much time do I have? 15 minutes, okay. I was more or less expecting this. So let's get to the developmental data instead. Remember, here the received view is claiming that children, they have a progressive maturation of mind reading capacities from 50-month-olds and after that. So there is kind of continuity in the development of mind reading abilities. Infants, they have problems to show them when they are very young, but mind reading abilities are already there, and they develop in full-blown mind reading abilities by the time of age 4, and even later, of course. So there is a claim of developmental continuity in this picture. But I wonder whether there is really such a strong continuity from the infant's capacity to the later children's abilities. Here there is a quote by Jeremy Carpenter and Sharon Lewis. Just because forms of activity look similar on the surface, we should not assume that they are always based on the same underlying causes. Just to give a visual representation of this, okay? Airplane, they fly, bird, they fly. Is it based on the same capacity? Well, of course not, right? The mechanisms that provide those abilities are completely different. So it might be the case that even in the case of mind reading, infants, they display some abilities in implicit false belief tasks, and children, they display some other abilities in explicit false belief tasks, but the capacities that are displayed in these two cases are significantly different from one from the other. So I won't go much in detail into this. I discussed several pieces of empirical information about this in a paper appeared on Minor Language in last June. But, well, I mean, I think, for example, here is a very important study that shows some kind of important discontinuity. Thurmore, Solian, and other authors, they were testing children transition longitudinally from 10 months to 5-year-olds, and they found that some cases of false belief tasks at age around the first year were predictive of later tasks in the tier point. But above all, to say, for example, the implicit false belief task at 15 months, they did not predict the explicit false belief task at age 4. The implicit false belief task did not predict some understanding of perception at 30 months. And there was some limited predictive capacity. For example, 18-month-olds, their results on implicit task, they would predict the later performance at age 4 in false belief task, but just on very particular cases of false belief tasks, those that are related to change of locations, but not other cases like unexpected content tasks. So, given these data, they argue that the evidence for task specificity that emerges from this study appears to support lean rather than rich accounts of mind reading in infancy. So the accounts where you have some continuity that depends on the fact that we are, of course, exploiting some similar things, but we are doing different things in the end when we are passing through these tasks at age 4. I refer you to this article if you want to have a further discussion of the details and even other arguments about this problem. So here we are opposing two views. According to the received view, we have some piece in our mind that is dedicated to attributing mental states to others. And this is a domain-specific process. But in my view, things are very different. So mind reading is just a kind of assembled practical competence. It is something that we learn to do in the course of our life by reusing different capacities to the sake of doing something that is important in our social life. But it is not important to predict others' behavior. It is important because it has become functional for other kinds of social regulation, in particular for justifying one's actions. I don't want to go into this now. So the idea is that mind reading is an assembled competence. It is like typewriting, okay? When you are typewriting, you are using different skills. You are using motoric skills, you are using reading skills, you are using writing skills. Of course, you have to know how to write things, so you have to been exposed to symbolic languages, and you have to be taught to write. So you're just recruiting different capacities to do one important thing for our species, that is writing. But it is not that we have some writing abilities that is innate in our brain. Our brain is just recruiting different abilities for the sake of doing something new. How is this view different from the one? I'm trying to develop some kind of empirical ways to test these two perspectives. And I think that in order to develop the empirical hypothesis, we have to get the distance from a general view about how language understanding works in our species. So this is a view that has been criticized at length by philosophers, in particular by Ludwig Wittgenstein. And it is a view that Wittgenstein attributes first to Augustine. So he writes in his philosophical investigation that according to Augustine, language learning is something that works like this. I have observed how I learned to speak, he says. Well, when my elders called some things by name and pointed it out while they spoke, I saw it and realized that the thing they wished to indicate was called by the name that they uttered. So it was that by frequently hearing words, I gradually identified the object with which the words stood for. So this is a kind of, it's a referential view about language, where the idea is that language is about a relation between words and objects in the world. And when you are learning language or learning to speak, what you have to learn is to associate the object with the particular word. So here I have a bottle of water, and I understand that "su" is the label for the content of this water, this bottle. So for example, if we are getting to belief in this referential account, which has been called also the ostension account of language understanding, the child can have some kind of understanding that the driver knows that we are here, and if the mother were saying something similar, that is, the driver knows we are here, for the child to learn the meaning of the sentence, for the child to learn the meaning of this word, it is for the child to map those words on his conceptual understanding of mental states. So conceptual understanding of language proceeds from conceptual understanding to semantic understanding. First, you need to have the concepts for things, and then you can interpret language that is given to you in terms of the concepts that you already have. If you don't have the concept, you cannot interpret the language. Therefore, you lack semantic understanding. So conceptual understanding is a prerequisite for verbal understanding. I cannot learn the name of the content of this bottle in Turkish if I don't have a concept for water. If I lack the concept, I don't get a way to understand what "su" refers to. Okay? So this is the ostension account of language understanding. By the way, they are following a huge discussion by Wittgenstein, Mead, Vygotsky. There have been proposed a different view about language acquisition. It's called the contextual account, and this is very different. So it starts from the idea that, well, the child has some confused understanding of the word and is continuously subjected to verbal reports. And what the child is doing is that when the mother is saying something like the driver knows that we are here, the child is trying to map the words on his own representation of the word. But under this account, the child might still lack conceptual understanding of the scene and still trying to guess what those words are referring to, what is the meaning of those words. So in this account, he first has some kind of semantic understanding, and then the child starts to react to what the mother is telling him. And this way, by adapting his behavior from time to time to the utterances of the mother, specializes his behavior in a way which reflects, in the end, semantic understanding of language. So in this account, we start from having some responses to behavioral utterances, and we end up in having semantic understanding in the end. Now, as to the concept of belief, what are beliefs? Well, beliefs are very complex objects, but two important features of them that are related to action in the following part. Beliefs are formed generally through perceptions. So I form a belief because I see that the bottle is there, or because somebody told me that the bottle is there. So I have perception that translates in my belief, and beliefs allow me to act on the world. Since I'm thirsty and there is a bottle, I know that there is a bottle in front of me, I will just grasp the bottle. So and we can define this context in very different ways, but here I would like to focus on belief formation contexts, where you acquire belief, and belief use contexts, where you use a belief that you have in order to act on the world. So under the Ospecian account, the assumption is that in order to understand belief reports, first you have the concept of belief, and then you can understand, and once you have this, you understand how beliefs are related to all kinds of perceptions, and they are useful in all kinds of situations. So the Ospecian account makes a prediction that once you have the concept of belief, you should be able to transfer easily knowledge about others' belief from one context to the other, and that there should be an easy connection between talk that is about belief and the concept, the representation of those beliefs in your mind. And this is something that I'm kind of relying on a paper by Joseph Penn in 2010 about who took the cognitive out of the mind. But on the contextual account, it seems that things are quite different. So you might have talked about, you might learn something about beliefs in a belief formation context. You might learn about something about belief in a belief use context, but you might still miss the connection between those different uses of the words. But it might be the case that eventually, by being exposed to different situations in which you are using, you hear about belief reports in cases of belief formation, and by being exposed to different contexts in which you hear belief reports about how belief cause actions, you might start to have an understanding of beliefs in belief formation and belief use context, and those might eventually collapse on something like a concept of belief. But in this second view, this is the contextual account, what is the conceptual understanding of belief is something we end with. It's not something that we started with that allow us to interpret the reports of beliefs at the start of the story. So, in looking for data about how those things might be collapsed together, I found just useful to discuss two different studies. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? So this is, I will just discuss briefly the knowledge access task. It is similar to the false belief task, but it is a simplified version. So here you have a child that is shown a box with a closed drawer containing a toy, and the child is asked, what do you think is inside? Of course, the child doesn't know, so just provide a random answer. But then the drawer is open, and the child is shown the content of the drawer. Okay? Then there is the task question. A puppet is produced, for example, Poppy or Polly, and the child is told, Polly has never seen inside this drawer. Now she comes. So does Polly knows what was in the drawer? And surprisingly, children until age 3 or 3.5, it depends really on the country, they say that Polly knows. So they didn't get the thing that because Polly wasn't present when the drawer was opened, then Polly doesn't know what's the content of the drawer. But it is interesting to realize what is the interpretation of this data. So, for example, Wellman writes that in success in the task is taken to test that children understand ignorance. That is, the fact that Polly does not know what is in the container. Now, the prompt here in this task is a verbal prompt. So, I think at first, this is a task not about understanding the concept of belief in general. It is just a task about understanding how beliefs are formed or are not formed in a situation, depending on the perception that we have of the scene. So it is not really a general task about the belief, but it's just a task about belief formation contexts. And second, it is a task where the child doesn't need to have a concept of belief in belief formation contexts in order to answer correctly. She might just have mastered this particular linguistic practice by which you know that beliefs are things that you don't form if you don't say that they are formed if they are if the agent who supposedly has to be attributed a belief is not aware or doesn't perceive a scene. So it's something that relates to language in a belief formation context. You have similar tasks. This is the reverse belief test in belief use contexts, and so which deal with different parts of the concept of belief. And the interesting thing is that, so according to a ostensible account of belief acquisition, you should have to master the concept of belief in order to deal with this task, to respond to belief reports either in belief formation or in belief use contexts. But it might be the case, and this is made possible by assuming an inferential account or a contextual account of language acquisition, that the child passes these tasks just by mastering linguistic practices in some kind of context, but not in the others. So, and actually we do have evidence that show that children, they master these situations in different moments of their lives. So if we take Western countries, we know that the children, they pass the diverse belief task before the knowledge access task, and then they pass the false belief task. But if we focus on, instead of Asian countries, we know that the order is reversed. Or even now, well, we have much more data about this, so it's just a mess. Some countries, they pass it earlier, so in some countries, the order is from knowledge access tasks to diverse belief tasks. Some other countries, they have the same order of Western countries. Some countries, you have distinction between children rise in cities and children rise in the countryside. So it's just kind of complicated to understand what is going on here. But certainly, you don't have a straightforward evolution of those capacities, which supports the idea that you can pass those tasks without having some central understanding of the concept of belief. Supporting even more this view, it is clear that even children that are passing the false belief tasks by age 4, they still are much confused about how beliefs are formed through perception of a scene. So this, and this allows me to get to the conclusions, supports an alternative reading of what's going on in the false belief task. So in the traditional interpretation of the task, children where they see that cell is putting the ball in the basket, sorry, they are supposed to attribute to Sally the belief that the ball is in the basket. And then they see what's going on, they see that hen is changing the location of the ball, and still when Sally is going back, they are supposed to recall their attributed belief that the ball is in the basket in order to make the right prediction that she will look for the ball in the basket rather than the box. But under an alternative account, we might assume that children at the start of the story, if they were asked, does Sally believe that the ball is in the basket? They should be able to say yes, because they could master particular practice of talking about beliefs in particular situations, in belief formation contexts. And even later, when they see that Sally goes for the ball in the basket, if they were asked, why is she looking for the ball there? They might maybe record the belief that they might be able to explain the thing by reporting Sally's belief. And actually, even in the situation where Sally comes back, maybe since they passed the knowledge access task before they passed the false belief tasks, maybe they should still be able to respond. Well, does Sally believe that the ball is in the box? Maybe they could be able to reply verbally to this question and still lack the conceptual understanding to get the story. So they would lack the understanding that it is exactly because Sally doesn't know that the ball is in the box, that when they are asked the question, the false belief task, they have to refer to the initial moment in the story where Sally put the ball in the basket in order to make the right prediction at the end of the story. So they just master different linguistic practices about belief attribution, but they lack a way to put those things together. So just to have a kind of review of the story I've been trying to tell you today, I've been challenging the received view about different features of it. I've been challenging that is a pervasive view about our social interaction. I have been challenged the idea that it is a view that we have mind-reading capacities because they have been selected in the course of natural evolution, and rather argued that mind-reading is a biocultural capacity. And I've been proposed, by looking at alternative ways to interpret the developmental data, that the false belief task might really task not really children's understanding of beliefs, but the way in which children learn to respond to verbal prompts of belief attributions. So if we look at children development, I would say that we have to be skeptical there is a theory of mind module by age 15 months. This depends on, this capacity might be provided by action reading processes, but not mind reading processes. And there is data supporting the view that there is no continuity between the infant's capacities and children's capacities. And when we get to children's 4 years old capacity to pass the false belief task, this might be explained by the verbal ability to talk about mental states rather than some deeper conceptual understanding of mental states. I want to thank Guido Garofoli, with which we wrote this huge article, and you for your attention.
Okay, so Bill is now going to give 10 minutes response. You have the college.
Okay. Should I come to the front?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit less audio-visual than Marco's. That's partly because I'm a philosopher and partly because I've been doing this at quite short notice. So I want to, you've heard I'm from the philosophy department, so I want to concentrate on some of the philosophical sort of underpinnings of what Marco's been doing. And I want to talk a little bit about a key move that Marco's making, which in the paper, or one of the papers on which the talk's based, he describes as moving from an inferentialist conception of belief to, from a referentialist conception. He wants to move from a referentialist understanding of the concept of belief to an inferentialist understanding of the concept of belief. And he wants to do this, at least in part, because it explains some puzzling data about discontinuities between the performance of pre-linguistic and linguistic children, and because it explains interesting cultural differences in the order in which certain tasks that we've taken to be relevant to the understanding of the concept of belief are passed. So the developmental divergences are in the order in which the knowledge acquisition test and the diverse belief test are passed. Okay, so I am sort of independently sympathetic to the basic philosophical move. As soon as I see a picture of Wittgenstein go up on the board, I'm very happy indeed. But what I want to do is push Marco a little bit and suggest that once we do this, it's tempting to rethink what the concept of belief is a concept of. Okay. Now, having talked to him beforehand, so that this didn't all come as such a shock, my impression is that Marco is at least partly sympathetic to being pushed in this direction. So that's good. Maybe we're not going to have a big fight up here, but just to make sure, just to give him an opportunity to back down, what I want to do is highlight one assumption I'm going to be making. Because this is going to be something that could give him a way of backing out. Okay. So the assumption that I'm going to make is that if you want to have an inferentialist account of the concept of belief, you're likely to want to have an inferentialist conception of other kinds of concepts. So I'm going to assume, as it were, that we're not being exceptionalist about the concept of belief here. And this is obviously going to give Marco a way of backing down if he feels he needs to. He can just say, well, I think this inferentialist conception applies to the concept of belief, but maybe not to other kinds of concepts. Okay, so we can avoid a fight if he wants to avoid a fight. But just to make sure that it's not too lovey-dovey, I'm also going to suggest that if we push things in the direction that I think you ought to push them, in fact, maybe the false belief test turns out to be more central than maybe he thought it was going to be. Okay, so I've given you a quick plan, but I suppose that a lot of you might want to know a little bit more about what an inferentialist account of concepts might be. Marco called it contextualist. So a good way of getting an idea about this is to think about two different ways in which you might understand the false belief test. So there's a way in which I guess almost everybody, and certainly almost everybody that does sort of developmental psychology is probably inclined to understand it. And then there's the way in which I think Marco wants to understand it. And I mean, I don't think that this is, you might think it's a completely eccentric thing to think, but I want to say, if you actually go back to the sort of original point at which the test was proposed, so in the kind of commentaries on Tremak and Woodruff's article on the chimpanzee's theory of mind, I suspect that some of the people who originally proposed it had a slightly different conception of what concepts might be, closer to the one that I take Marco to have. Okay, so on a representationalist conception then, I take it concepts are representations in some kind of mental medium, and the capacity to perform certain kinds of inference is evidence of the possession of the right kind of representation. So on this account, our inference from somebody's having the inferential capacity to their possessing the concept is a kind of ampliative inference. Okay? What do I mean by that? What we're saying is, okay, we've got the capacity, we can see the capacity, and we infer the existence of the representation, and it's a form of inference of the best explanation. So, two things to note about that. I mean, first of all, if it's an inference of the best explanation, we're leaving open the possibility that you could have the capacity without having the representation. Of course, you owe someone a story if you want to give a different explanation of the capacity as to what explains the capacity. All I want to say is, we're making some kind of inferential move here. More importantly, you can have the representation without having the capacity. Right? There might be something that stops you being able to deploy the representation in the right kind of way. Okay, so that, I take it, is a fairly standard view of what's going on in the false belief test. And you might think it's the only possible view. Okay, you might think, what else is there to think? So here's the alternative. The alternative, I take it, is that what a concept is, just is the inferential capacity. That if you like to use a word philosophers like to use a lot, concepts are constituted by inferential capacities. Okay, so is that a crazy view? Well, maybe it is. I think it's also philosophically a fairly mainstream kind of view. And I wouldn't be that surprised. I mean, I haven't done sort of a huge amount of sort of philosophical biography here, but it seems to me that, you know, in 1978, when Freeman and Woodruff wrote their article, that was an even more mainstream view about what concepts are than maybe it is now. Okay, so why might you hold this kind of view? Well, here's one answer. I take it means that having a concept isn't going to be an all or nothing matter. Okay? On the representationalist view, it looks as though it is, right? You've either got these representations or you haven't got them. Okay? If you think of concepts as just being inferential capacities, then you can possess them more or less well. You can possess some of the capacities that are linked with a concept, but not others. Okay, so you might think that's quite a nice view to hold if you're a developmentalist. After all, you know, on a developmental view, you might want to say that things are not going to be an all or nothing matter. Okay, now I also want to say, look, somebody who holds this view isn't committed to the idea that there's no explanation of why we have these concepts. Okay, so suppose you have this view. What should you think about what beliefs are? It seems as though you've really got two options. Okay. One would be to have a representationalist conception of beliefs. Beliefs are representations of states of affairs. Now, on a traditional view about the relationship between concepts and beliefs, we think of beliefs as being representations that are somehow made up of concepts. And if you have a representationalist view of concepts, that makes a lot of sense, right? Okay. You've got one representation being made up of several other representations, and that's exactly how we think representation works. Okay. If you think that concepts are inferential capacities, it's a lot harder to see what the relationship between beliefs and concepts is going to be. Okay? So maybe what you need to do is take up something like an inferentialist conception of belief. What might that look like? Well, I'm not sure, but here's one possibility. Okay. You might think that on an inferentialist view, to have a belief is to have a commitment to a certain pattern of inferences. Okay? So if I believe it's raining, I've got a commitment to infer from the fact that I want to go outside to the action, to my taking my coat, or to the belief that I should take my coat, or possibly to the intention of taking my coat. You can see that just like Marco has very Italian-style examples, I have very British-style examples. It's a completely incomprehensible example from a Turkish point of view. Yeah. If it's raining outside, I should just not want to go outside, right? Why would you do that? Okay, so if you and I are committed to the same inferences, then it looks as though I've not got very much use for the concept of belief. Why would I need it? Well, suppose, as it were, I am English and you're Turkish, and we are committed to different patterns of inference. Here's where I need the concept of belief. I need the concept of belief as a way of making, as it were, my inferential stance explicit. I need it as a way of marking inferential patterns to which you're committed, but to which I'm not. Okay? So if I'm committed to taking my coat when I go outside, but you're not, that's because, well, okay, I've got a belief that it's raining and you don't. Okay, so here's the bit where I think Marco's going to disagree. Okay, and the worry is, on this account, it looks as though what we really need to have the concept of belief is this capacity to deal with inferences that are about having diverse beliefs. So it looks as though on this account, maybe, I'm not sure about this, but this is one thing that it might commit me to, a view on which the diverse belief test and the false belief test are much more central to our conception of belief than the knowledge acquisition test is. Okay, I've overrun slightly, but I hope that is something to Marco to think about.